In class 21, we wrapped up our discussion of how courts review agency interpretations of the law, of statutes, and of their own regulations, before turning to the question of when courts may review agency actions in the first place. So, beginning with agency interpretations of ambiguous regulations, after Talk America, the court was beginning to express some doubts about Auer. And then we get Kaiser v. Wilkie last year, where it looked like the court might overturn that doctrine. Instead, the court keeps it alive with Justice Roberts, or Chief Justice Roberts, supplying the critical fifth vote on stare decisis grounds. But the court also limits Auer deference quite a bit, giving it a long list of qualifications and limitations and requirements. So there must be, the court says, some genuine ambiguity in the regulation. That ambiguity must remain after exhausting the traditional tools of statutory construction, so text, purpose, and structure, legislative history, canons of construction. The agency's interpretation must be reasonable, and it must be based on traditional tools of statutory construction. The court must also make an independent inquiry into whether the character and the context of the agency interpretation entitles it to controlling weight. The agency interpretation must also be rooted somehow in the agency's substantive expertise, and it must reflect some kind of fair and considered judgment to get deference. So the bottom line is we've taken this fairly bright line rule and replaced it with this complicated analysis that we do even before Auer applies in the first place, sort of an Auer step zero that is going to ask a lot of the same questions that then Auer itself will look at later. And if we believe the Chief Justice and Justice Kavanaugh, the difference between getting rid of Auer and keeping it around in this newly neutered form is not very large. The new requirements in Auer step zero are going to be pretty demanding. And so not a lot of regulations will really get Auer deference. And we're going to fall back on Skidmore, which is going to ask how persuasive the agency's reasoning is, although that's pretty similar to the things that the court analyzes in Auer step zero anyway. And so if those two justices are right that the traditional tools rather of construction will almost always give an unambiguous meaning, then this seems to suggest that the vast majority of Chevron cases won't even get to step two in the first place, which would be a really interesting and potentially important development because it's going to give agencies less flexibility and less power to exercise their policy discretion when enacting regulations. Then we turn to reviewability, which is a set of doctrines about when courts can review agency agency actions in the first place and what the timing requirements and kind of mechanical requirements of doing that are. Under the APA, agency actions are subject to review most of the time. There's this presumption of reviewability. And sections 701 through 706 create that right of review and define its scope, but it's not automatic. So 701A gives us 2 times when the APA review provisions do not apply. It says, this chapter applies, and the chapter meaning the 700s, the things about judicial review, apply except to the extent that one of 2 things is true. The statutes, meaning the Organic Act here, the Clean Air Act or whatever, precludes judicial review, or agency action is committed to agency discretion by law. And so we have 2 kinds of cases where the court just can't hear it at all, where the statute says so, or where agency action is committed to agency discretion. Our 2 cases today were about the first of these 2, when the statute precludes review. And we saw that this can happen either explicitly or implicitly. So in Johnson versus Robeson, the court considered a claim that the Veterans Readjustment Benefit Act of 1966 was unconstitutional because it provided educational benefits for veterans who served in the military, but not draftees who did alternative civilian service. And the statute said that decisions under the act were not subject to judicial review. But the court construed the language to apply to determinations about the amount and eligibility of individual benefits by individual claimants, not to arguments that the whole scheme was unconstitutional. And they construed it this way to avoid a potential constitutional problem that would arise if Congress said courts couldn't evaluate the constitutionality of the law. That would be a really hard question for the court because it would create potentially this massive loophole to the Constitution. But Article 3 specifically says Congress can create exceptions to jurisdiction. And so there's been this uneasy detente between the courts and Congress where Congress avoids using that power too much, and the courts avoid holding that it doesn't have that power. And so here it gives us a reading of the text that is not the most natural reading, but it's probably consistent with Congress's intent. It's probably why Congress intended to avoid review in the first place, was they didn't want the courts getting involved in like all of these individual veterans claiming educational benefits. And so this is a good example of how the court will kind of go out of its way to avoid finding express preclusion under 701A1. Oddly though, implicit preclusion is more common. So Block versus Community Nutrition Institute is our main example here, where we have a challenge to a milk marketing order from the Department of Agriculture that was brought by a consumer who objected because it raised the price of milk and milk products and stuff. But the court says that the structure of the statute makes clear that consumers are not one of the groups that can seek review of these orders. So the statute allowed for judicial review by producers and by handlers of milk products, but only after they had exhausted their administrative remedies. And that was in the context of this detailed and complicated statute that created this system of negotiations and votes by the department and producers and handlers, and eventually got these market orders in place. And consumers are just not a part of this at all. They're not mentioned in the statute. And so if we think that consumers can challenge it, that means they don't have to exhaust their administrative remedies like the others do, but they can still seek review under the APA. Or alternatively, we can say consumers aren't intended to be able to get review under the APA here at all. And so the court adopts that second view, that consumers are implicitly excluded from bringing a challenge under the Administrative Procedure Act. Consumers do have a real harm here because prices go up, but that's a harm that's contemplated by the statute. That's like the whole point of the statute, is to raise prices to avoid pricing bubbles, to create some price consistency, and in the end to lead to a more stable and healthy market for milk producers and milk handlers. And if consumers have to pay slightly higher prices, Congress understood that and was okay with that. And so if you let consumers seek review, it might undercut the purpose of the statute. And it might also create this big loophole because producers and handlers are probably also consumers. And so if they can just seek review as a producer, it helps them just, or as a consumer, it just helps them get around the requirement of exhausting administrative remedies in the first place. And so even though we have a presumption of review, that presumption can be overcome by strong evidence of congressional intent. And so even though nothing expressly precluded consumers from seeking review here, the court found that that intent was clear in the structure of the statute. But this is a relatively unusual outcome. There are other cases where the court has emphasized that the presumption of judicial review is a strong one and has come close to even suggesting that blocking judicial review would be unconstitutional, even though Article 3 says Congress can create exceptions. And so if Congress wants to insulate a category of decisions from judicial review, it's going to have to be really explicit. But if it does that, then we'll probably default back to the previous case where the court goes out of its way to interpret the statute to allow review anyway. So that's the exception under 701A1 for when statutes preclude judicial review. Next time we will discuss the other half of this when agency action is committed to discretion by law. See you then.